You know, they say land is the only thing that lasts, that it's the one thing they're not making any more of. But nobody tells you what happens when you inherit 1,200 acres of it only to find out an entire kingdom has been built on top of your dirt while you weren't looking. The day the probate court finally cleared the last dusty file from my parents' estate, handing me the deed to Blackwood Ridge, I didn't feel like a land baron. I felt like a guy who just wanted to see where his grandfather used to hunt deer, maybe walk the tree line, breathe some air that didn't smell like city exhaust. I tossed my beat-up duffel bag into my truck, drove 4 hours north, and expected to find wilderness, overgrown trails, maybe a collapsed cabin or two, but what I found instead was a gate, a massive, wrought-iron monstrosity with a security guard named Officer Miller standing there in a uniform that cost more than my first car, telling me I was trespassing on my own inheritance. I stood there for a long, heavy second, the keys to my truck still digging into my palm, watching the dust settle around my boots, trying to process the visual dissonance of seeing manicured hedges, perfect asphalt, and rows of identical McMansions stretching out over the hills where Grandpa Silas used to swear the only law was the wind and the rain. Miller wasn't rude, which almost made it worse. He was professional, detached, reciting a script he'd probably used on lost delivery drivers 1,000 times, saying, "Sir, if you aren't a resident of the summit at Blackwood, I need you to turn your vehicle around." And I just stared past him at the street signs with names like Serenity Lane and Whispering Oak, watching a woman jog past with a golden retriever, completely oblivious that she was running on earth that didn't belong to the developer who sold her that house. I tried to explain. I showed him my ID. I told him my name. And that's when the pity hit his eyes, that look you give a confused dog. And he said, "I'm sorry, son, but this land was developed 20 years ago. You're looking for something that doesn't exist anymore." That was the moment the coin dropped. The moment I realized this wasn't a clerical error or a wrong turn, but a system, a massive, breathing machine that had swallowed my family's legacy whole. You have to understand, I didn't grow up rich. Grandpa Silas bought this land for pennies after the war when it was just rock and scrub. He worked it with calloused hands, buried his wife under the big elm on the South Ridge, and left it wild because he believed nature didn't need a landlord. But when my folks died young, I was a kid, too stupid to know about probate limbo, too grief-stricken to check on acreage that was stuck in state management for decades. Life just happened. I built a career, paid rent, lived in the now, assuming the then would wait for me. But land doesn't wait. It gets noticed, it gets covetous looks, and apparently, it gets stolen by people wearing polo shirts. 2 days after the gate incident, I got the email, not from a lawyer, but from the Summit Homeowners Association, a polite, sterile invitation to a clarifying meeting at the home of the board president, a woman named Victoria Sterling. I drove up there, past the gate where Miller waved me through with a suspicious glare, winding up the hill to the biggest house in the subdivision, a sprawling estate that looked down on the rest of the neighborhood like a feudal castle. And there she was, Victoria, greeting me with a handshake that felt like gripping a cold stone, wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. We sat in her sun-drenched kitchen, overlooking the valley my grandfather loved, and she laid out binders, thick, glossy, color-coded binders that smelled like fresh ink and money, showing me the development plans, the permits, the infrastructure, the millions of dollars poured into utilities and roads. She didn't yell, she didn't threaten. She just looked at me with this terrifying, maternal condescension and said, "We understand your family has history here, but you have to be realistic. Your inheritance is symbolic. It's a sentimental story, not a legal reality." And the way she said symbolic made my blood run cold, like she was explaining to a toddler why he couldn't keep a stray cat. She offered me a check, a goodwill gesture she called it, enough to buy a nice car, but not enough to buy back my dignity, or alternatively, she said I could sign a non-resident waiver, pay a small annual fee, and be allowed to visit the community parks during designated hours. I looked around that kitchen, at the granite countertops, the view she had stolen, the absolute confidence radiating off her that I was just a bug on her windshield, and I realized she wasn't afraid of my deed because she believed money had rewritten the law. I told her no. I told her I didn't want her money. I wanted my land, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, her smile vanishing into a tight, thin line, as she said. Resisting progress can be very expensive, young man. A veiled threat that hung in the air like smoke. I walked out, feeling her eyes boring into my back, and drove straight to the county clerk, naively thinking the truth would be easy to find. But by the time I got home, the war had already started. The first letter arrived in a heavy, cream-colored envelope, thanking me for my anticipated cooperation and notifying me that a review of my status was underway, which was corporate speak for, "We are about to bury you." 3 days later, the second letter hit, this one demanding $45,000 in back dues, claiming that even though I hadn't lived there, my land ownership technically made me a member by default, and I was liable for 15 years of road maintenance, security fees, and landscaping for a clubhouse I'd never entered. I laughed then, a dry, humorless sound in my empty kitchen, thinking it was a bluff, but the third letter wasn't funny. It was a list of violations: unauthorized fencing, my grandfather's old stone walls, unapproved vegetation, the ancient forests, and failure to submit architectural plans, culminating in a threat of enforcement procedures. A word that didn't mean a lawsuit. It meant they were coming to take what was left. I tried to call the number on the letterhead, getting transferred through a labyrinth of assistants until I reached a compliance officer named Janet, whose voice was so robotic I wasn't sure she was human. And when I asked how I could be fined for a club I never joined, she just repeated, "Our records show inclusion," like a mantra, refusing to acknowledge that I hadn't signed a single piece of paper. I stopped calling. I started collecting, turning my dining room table into a war room, scanning every thread, every absurd invoice, every demand, realizing that Victoria Sterling wasn't trying to win a legal argument. She was building a paper trail, a mountain of unanswered notices that would make me look like a negligent deadbeat to any judge who just skimmed the file. I drove out to the property line that weekend, just to feel the ground, to remind myself what I was fighting for. And that's when I saw the orange stakes, fresh and bright, driven into the soil 50 yards past the old boundary line my grandfather had marked with iron pipes. And I saw a crew of men in neon vests moving deeper into the woods, and I knew right then, standing in the shadows of the trees, that they weren't just squatting anymore. They were expanding. I walked up to the survey crew, my heart hammering against my ribs not from fear, but from a cold, focused rage, and asked who signed their work order, to which the foreman, a guy chewing on a toothpick, just pointed up the hill and said, "The association, buddy, take it up with them," before casually tapping a stake into the ground over a patch of moss where I knew Grandpa Silas had buried his favorite hound. I called the police, naive enough to think a badge meant protection. But when the 2 cruisers from the Blackwood County Sheriff's Department rolled up, they didn't even look at my deed. They looked at Victoria Sterling, who had descended from her hilltop fortress to stand by her SUV with her arms crossed, watching the scene with the bored expression of someone watching a rerun. The officers listened to me for about 30 seconds before one of them, Deputy Evans, gave me the line that serves as the universal shrug of law enforcement in these situations. "Sir, this is a civil matter. We can't intervene in boundary disputes." And then, I swear to God, he gave Victoria a polite nod, a little tip of the hat, and I realized with a sinking feeling that she didn't just own the homeowners. She owned the narrative, the local influence, the very air we were breathing. I went home and stopped playing defense. I stopped trying to reason with a machine designed to grind me down, and I hired Atticus Thorne, a real estate attorney who looked like he slept in his suit and smelled like old law library books, a man who specialized in messy titles. And I hired Mac, a forensic surveyor who hated subdivisions more than I did, a guy who tracked property lines by reading the scars on old oak trees and finding iron pins buried under 3 feet of modern landscaping. Mac went out to the site while Atticus dove into the archives. And that's when the civil matter turned into a guerrilla war, because Victoria Sterling realized I wasn't going away, and the letters stopped being polite. It started small, a psychological erosion, like finding 3 brand new roofing nails propped up in the tread of my truck tires after I'd parked near the access road, perfectly placed to blow a sidewall the moment I accelerated. Then came the trash, piles of drywall and rotting fast food bags dumped right at my gate, followed by a cleanup fee citation from the HOA for unsightly debris. A perfect, circular trap of harassment. But the moment the game changed, the moment I decided I would burn their whole kingdom to the ground if I had to, was when my wife, Elena, called me shaking, saying a black sedan had been tailing her to work, idling at the end of our driveway. And then my son, Leo, came home from middle school quiet, refusing to eat, eventually admitting that a teacher had asked him if we were moving soon because she'd heard my family was in financial trouble. I installed cameras that night, hidden in the tree line, motion activated, for K resolution, and within 48 hours I caught them. 2 men in Summit security windbreakers creeping onto my property at 2 a.m., flashlights sweeping the woods, not looking for intruders, but looking for me, checking to see how close they could get to my house without triggering a response. I showed the footage to the sheriff, and again, civil matter, hard to prove intent. Just enough ambiguity to let them off the hook. But I didn't care anymore because Mac, my surveyor, called me to meet him at the edge of the woods, his face pale, holding a collection of yellowed, brittle maps that didn't match the glossy brochures in Victoria's office. They never bought it, Mac whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he pointed to a jagged line on the original plat. The developer, Ridgeview Corp., they didn't buy the land from the estate. They signed a 99-year development lease with a 20-year renewal clause that required the signature of the heir. That's you. And if they didn't get it, the lease voided automatically. I stared at the paper, the world tilting on its axis, realizing that the renewal date had passed 5 years ago, meaning every house, every road, every blade of grass in the Summit was legally sitting on land they no longer had a right to occupy. Atticus took that thread and pulled, ripping the entire tapestry apart, discovering that the original title insurance policy, the document that convinced the banks to lend millions of dollars for these homes, relied on a title clearance opinion written by a junior attorney 20 years ago who claimed the heir was unreachable, and that constructive possession applied. And the name on that legal opinion? The name of the young, ambitious lawyer who signed off on the fraud that built this empire, who buried the requirement for my signature under mountains of legal jargon. Victoria Sterling. She wasn't just the HOA president protecting her neighborhood. She was the architect of the lie, living in the penthouse of a house of cards she had built on a foundation of forgery. My attorney looked at me, a grim smile touching his lips, and said, "This isn't a boundary dispute anymore, kid. This is enterprise fraud. This is a massive, multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme of dirt, and we are about to pull the bottom block." I went to the bank, not the local branch, but the regional headquarters of the lender holding the majority of the mortgages, and I walked into the VP's meeting with Atticus, slapping the expired lease and Victoria's fraudulent memo on the mahogany table. I told them, "I own the land your collateral is sitting on, and right now, your mortgage holders are trespassing." And I watched the color drain from the banker's face as he realized that if I was right, their title insurance was void, their loans were unsecured, and they were exposed to losses that would make shareholders jump out of windows. I wasn't just fighting an HOA anymore. I was holding a grenade in a room full of explosives, and I looked the banker in the eye and said, "I don't want to evict families. I want the truth, and I want the woman who orchestrated this to lose everything." The courtroom didn't smell like justice. It smelled like floor wax and anxiety, a heavy, suffocating atmosphere where Victoria Sterling sat with her legal team, a phalanx of high-priced suits, looking slightly less like a queen and more like a cornered viper, her gold lapel pin catching the fluorescent light. Judge Reynolds, a man with a face like carved granite who had no patience for theatrics, skipped the opening arguments and went straight to the documents, his glasses perched on the end of his nose as he read the original lease, then the expiration clause, then the fraudulent title opinion Atticus had blown up on a projector screen for the whole room to see. The silence in that room was physical, a taut wire stretching tighter and tighter as the judge flipped pages, until he finally stopped, took off his glasses, and looked directly at Victoria's lead counsel, asking in a voice that was terrifyingly calm, "Counselor, is your client aware that by the plain text of this agreement, the entire subdivision known as the Summit is currently engaged in mass trespassing?" The lawyer tried to pivot, stuttering about good faith reliance and community stability, but Judge Reynolds cut him off with a hand wave that felt like a gavel strike. Turning his gaze to Victoria, who was staring straight ahead, her jaw clenched so hard I thought her teeth might shatter. "The court finds," the judge said, his voice echoing off the wood paneling, "that the plaintiff holds superior title, that the lease has expired, and that the title clearance opinion authored by Ms. Sterling appears to be legally imaginative, to put it politely. He didn't just rule in my favor. He dismantled them, issuing an immediate injunction freezing the HOA's authority, dissolving the board, and referring the matter of the fraudulent title opinion to the State Attorney General's office for criminal investigation. I walked out of that courthouse into a storm of camera flashes, reporters shouting questions, but I didn't stop. I just looked over at Victoria, who was standing alone by a pillar, frantically whispering into her phone, her empire crumbling in real time as the banks began the process of seizing her assets to cover their liability. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw fear, raw, naked fear, because she knew that the paperwork she used to bludgeon me was now the weapon that would end her. But the victory wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the responsibility, because now I had 300 terrified families looking at me, people who had bought homes in good faith, innocent pawns who thought I was coming to bulldoze their lives. I could have evicted them. The law said I could, and a darker part of me wanted to scrub the land clean, but I remembered Grandpa Silas saying that land requires respect, and destroying innocent lives to punish the guilty isn't justice, it's just vengeance. So, I filled the power vacuum not with eviction notices, but with peace treaties. I sent a letter to every resident, except Victoria and her cronies on the board, offering them a 40-year ground lease, a simple, fair contract with fixed rates, no aesthetic rules, no fines for the wrong color mailboxes, just a legal way to stay in their homes. The HOA was dead, replaced by a simple landlord-tenant agreement for the ground beneath their feet, and the change in the neighborhood was palpable, a collective exhale as people realized they were free from the tyranny of the clipboard Nazis. I denied leases to the board members who had harassed my family, forcing them to sell their houses at a loss to the bank, and Victoria Sterling lost everything. Her house on the hill was seized, her law license was revoked, and she left town in a rented U-Haul, a ghost of the power she used to wield. Property values actually went up, stabilized by the clarity of the new leases, and the neighborhood became a real community, one where people waved at me when I drove my truck through the gate that no longer had a guard. I stood on the hill where Victoria's house used to overlook my land, watching the sun set over Blackwood Ridge, feeling the soil beneath my boots, solid and real, knowing I had reclaimed my legacy not by becoming a monster, but by slaying one. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night, the question I leave you with. I won, I saved the land, and I protected the innocent homeowners. But was it mercy or was it weakness to let the people who benefited from the theft stay on the land my grandfather wanted wild? Did I restore justice, or did I just become a benevolent version of the system I hated? Because when you hold the keys to the kingdom, it's hard to tell if you're the hero or just the new king. What would you have done?